Perhaps you heard about the couple who had been married for 50 years. On their anniversary night, as they retired to bed, they turned the light out and crawled into bed. And after they'd been there for a few seconds, she said, "Walter, do you remember what you did 50 years ago tonight?" And he said, "No, what?" And said, "You gave me a hug before we went to sleep." "Yeah, okay." So he kind of half-heartedly gave her a hug. Tried to go to sleep. A minute or so later, she broke the silence and said, "Walter, you remember what you did 50 years ago on this night? You gave me a kiss. Good night." "Oh, okay, all right." So he kind of leaned over and half-heartedly gave her a peck on the cheek. A few minutes passed. He was almost asleep. She said, "Walter, you remember what else you did 50 years ago tonight?" He said, "You nibbled on my ear." Well, he jumped out of bed in a huff and started walking away. And she said, "Walter, where are you going?" He said, "I'm going to get my teeth." That's a terrible way to start this service. Marriages are filled with plenty of ups and downs and joys and sorrows, and beauty fades and muscles ache and teeth crack, but true commitment outlasts it all. And for those who stand the test of time, they enjoy the journey due in large part to their commitment to God and to one another. You probably noticed that throughout this series on marriage that in the Old Testament, there's not a whole lot of shining examples of marriage. In fact, most all of them are pretty poor examples. But through these stories of God's people throughout the Bible, God's hand is seen even through imperfection, and sometimes because of imperfection. Now, Abraham and Sarah, who we're going to study today, they certainly weren't perfect. Their marriage was far from it. And their lives were marked with patience and confusion and foolishness and frustration and excitement and promises and waiting on God. And from them, we can learn a few things that I think will be very helpful to those of us who are married and those of you who may become married in the years to come. So I'm going to talk about 4 different ways to cultivate commitment. The first way is this: commitment is strengthened by a mutual faith. If you both share a common commitment to Christ, you share something that is incredible. I have been at countless weddings that Bob Russell has performed. And many times he will look at the bride and the groom and he will say this. He'll say, "I want you all to imagine a triangle, and each of you are at the point of each of the base at the bottom. But I want you to imagine that at the top point is where God is." And he says, "You'll find that the closer each of you draw to God, the closer each of you draw to one another." And that's true. And it's good for us to remember. Now, Abraham and Sarah, they started off with a different type of background when it came to their faith. They both grew up in Ur, and Sarah has to leave everything, including her family and friends and hometown, to go out from there to be on this trip and this marriage with Abraham, where they have no definite ending to where their destination is going to be. Now, it may help us to understand what Sarah left back in Ur. Archaeologists have discovered that Ur was a city with brick homes. Some of them were 2-story brick homes. You can imagine that. It was a very advanced city for its years. They have excavated some signs that there was actually indoor plumbing that they had routed some things around. It was a wealthy area. And Abraham and his father Terah were wealthy, and they had huge herds and flocks and servants, and they would have lived well in Ur. But the city of Ur offered a luxurious material culture, and it was renowned for their study of astrology and astronomy. And so Sarah was giving up the Kentucky Center for the Arts and the Speed Art Museum and the Yum Center in order to go to a more rural setting and to have a life basically as a nomad, living in tents, moving from place to place. That's what she gave up. And in a way, some of you have done that in your marriage. And you've gone along with your spouse for the pursuit of an education, or maybe because of a career choice or a new job, or perhaps for a school system that you wanted your kids to be a part of. and you launched out and you left home and you went a different direction. Now, the other important part to understand with this story is that the inhabitants of Ur worshiped idols. There were large temples to the gods, lowercase g. Joshua 24 later tells us that Terah, Abraham's father, lived beyond the river and worshiped other gods. But Abraham changed that, and Abraham chose to worship the one true God. And Sarah united with him and chose to do the same thing. And so they have this mutual faith, even though they had had an upbringing that was very different. Now they chose to worship the one true God, Jehovah. And interestingly, in Hebrews chapter 11, the very first woman that is mentioned in the hall of faith there in Hebrews 11 is Sarah. They were united in their faith. They agreed that God would be the main important person in their life. Now, whenever we talk to people who are considering dating or are dating, we always encourage them to make certain that that person, that other individual, is completely committed to Jesus Christ. Paul says in the New Testament in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? And so if that relationship can move closer toward marriage, we want to make certain that they're both on that same spiritual page, because that's a big key when it comes to cultivating commitment. And for those who become a Christian after marriage and they find themselves married to a non-believer, what are they supposed to do? Well, that was the situation of the church in Corinth, because Christianity explodes on the scene. Now, all of a sudden, all of these people are leaving Judaism and they're choosing to become a Christ follower, and they are accepting Jesus as the Messiah, so they are a completed Jew, but now they're faced with the fact that their spouse doesn't believe. So what are they to do? And in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul gives them some advice. He tells them not to divorce their mate, but to try to lead them to Christ. Bible commentator William Barclay says, in a marriage partnership between a believer and unbeliever, the very association may be the means of saving the soul of the unbelieving partner. In 1 Peter chapter 3, the opening verses, it says, wives, in the same way submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Someone described this as the quiet leading of a lovely life. So pray for that unbelieving spouse. Let them see the love of Christ in you by the way you speak to them and to your family members and to others. So have that common mutual faith. Here's the second key to cultivating commitment. Commitment works through major challenges. Some of our marital challenges are the result of our own mistakes. And when Abraham and Sarah go through Egypt on their way to the land God was taking them to, they encounter a pretty rough time. Listen to Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 through 16. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that Sarah was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake. And Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But you know what happens next? The Lord inflicts a serious disease on Pharaoh and his household. And the secret is exposed. There has to be some honesty that comes out. And he realizes that Abraham's lie is why God has afflicted them. And he says, take your wife and get out of here. You see, Abraham makes a foolish decision in order to save his own hide. And this was not uncommon for a person to lie about their attractive wife in order to save themselves. But Abraham's decision, nonetheless, is demeaning to the institution of marriage, and it is selfish. And it displays a lack of trust in God. And Sarah goes along with this, and this is a sign that at this point in their marriage and ministry, their faith is pretty immature, but it's going to keep growing in spite of some different mistakes that they'll make along the way. Now, Scripture doesn't tell us all about the private conversations that they have and how they work through this, but we know that they stay together. You ever get mad at your spouse? Don't put your hands up. We all do, right? It's common. One of you makes a hurtful comment. One of you publicly embarrasses the other one. One of you spends money without asking for the other person's blessing. It's like the guy who said to his wife, I wouldn't marry you again if you were the only woman on the face of the earth. And she said, of course you wouldn't. You'd be killed in the stampede. Wow. I'm not going to argue with her. The key to resolving conflicts and overcoming those challenges which seem insurmountable is wrapped up in your priorities and your commitment. And notice that with Abraham, even in the face of sin and selfishness and also stupidity, Abraham and Sarah were committed. Well, thirdly, let's see that commitment survives the ups and downs of life. God had promised Abraham and Sarah a huge amount of offspring, but they were getting older and older and older, and there were still no children. Now, whether you specifically understand that particular struggle or not, of being able to have a child, you surely understand the struggle that comes when life doesn't go the way you thought that it would. And the circumstances of life have a way of straining your relationships, even the ones in your marriage. Even your children, even your closest friends. And when expectations aren't met, hopes are dashed. And if we're not careful, molehills become mountains, and the little things mushroom and grow and become big things. Listen to me. Satan would love nothing more than to turn the person who is supposed to be your closest ally into your enemy. Don't let him do that. Look at what happens here in Genesis 16. Earlier we saw Abraham making a big blunder, lying about the identity of his own wife to save his own hide. Now in Genesis 16, Sarah is going to make her own huge mistake, and Abraham is just going to go along with it. Listen to this, the opening verses. Now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Abram agreed to what Sarah said. Husbands, a word to the wise. There are some times when you are not supposed to agree with your wife. This is one of those times. But this man of God, he doesn't even hesitate. She says, hey, sleep with the maid. And immediately he says, okay. If ever there was a place and a time for this patriarch to ponder or to allow for a pregnant pause, no pun intended. But Sarah suggests it, and Abraham is already putting on his Axe body spray and heading out the door, you know? Guys are accused of having a one-track mind, and Abraham doesn't help us in the defense of our case, gentlemen. And we probably deserve the criticism. I don't know if you all saw the story of what took place down in Atlanta a few months ago. An ad was placed in the personal section of an Atlanta newspaper. It said, single black female seeks male companionship. Ethnicity not important. I'm a very good-looking girl who loves to play. I love long walks in the woods, hunting, camping, fishing trips, cozy winter nights lying by the fire. Candlelight dinners will have me eating out of your hand. Rub me the right way and watch me respond. I'll be at the front door when you get home from work, wearing only what nature gave me. Kiss me and I'm yours. Call 404-875-6420 and ask for Daisy. 15,000 men responded to this ad. And when they called, they reached the Atlanta Humane Society. where a 9-week-old black Labrador retriever named Daisy was waiting to be adopted. Sad thing is, I saw some of the single guys writing that number down as I was saying, you know. It's a safe statement to make that men can put more emphasis on the physical rather than on the emotional or on the spiritual. And when Sarah said to Abraham, hey, go and sleep with my servant Hagar, Abraham should have taken his role as a longtime believer in God. He should have spiritually led his wife. And he said, honey, I hear what you're saying. I understand why you're saying it. I know we've waited a long time, but my faithfulness to you is more important than whether or not we ever have a child. Besides, God promised. He promised that I will have numerous descendants, and regardless of our age, as crazy as it sounds, I'm going to trust his plan. But that's not what Abraham says. It's not what Abraham does. And it's not the way that the story unfolds. Verses 3-6. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarah said to Abram, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Your slave is in your hands, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. So then Sarah mistreated Hagar, and so Hagar fled from her. Hagar became pregnant and has a son named Ishmael. I want to make certain you get this. The majority of the conflicts in the Middle East today are a direct result from this chapter in the Bible. Ishmael and his descendants, at odds with who Abraham is about to have, and 13 years later, Isaac and his descendants, battling over inheritance and who land rightly belongs to. Some 13 years later than this, after the normal childbearing years, Sarah gets pregnant and Isaac is born. And God's promise that Abraham's descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky now become possible. Look at Genesis 21, 1-3. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son that Sarah bore him. Abraham and Sarah, even through what was surely one of the most painful times in their lives, they still stayed together. The longest wait in the history of mankind for two people to be able to have a child and then for God to bless them. Well, here's the final key to cultivate, and that is commitment means being faithful until death. Faithful until death, through good and bad. Abraham and Sarah stood together. When it was all said and done, they hung in there, they stuck it out. Genesis chapter 25, verse 10. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. You may have picked up throughout my lesson today that in our discussion of commitment, most of what we've talked about might come across as being a little bit negative. I mean, we haven't said, hey, commitment is fun, or commitment is really easy, or you're always gonna feel like keeping your commitment no matter what. Now, that's not what we said, because that's not true. That's not a realistic view of marriage. You need to know that there will be plenty of conflicts and challenges, but working through them and inviting God in on the process, that makes all the difference in the world. Now, don't get me wrong. I have experienced very few things that give me great joy like my marriage gives me. I see the same in many of your marriages as well, and I see the joy that it brings you. But I can also, in the same breath, tell you this. You won't truly know that you've made a commitment until it's difficult to keep that commitment. When life is easy and the decisions are mutual and the laughter comes easily, that doesn't take commitment. The commitment is there, but you don't even notice it. When you need commitment is when things are hard, when there's no laughter, when you disagree. That's when you learn whether or not you truly are committed. When your wife hurts you with the words that she says, your commitment can overcome your hurt. When your husband does that thing that just drives you crazy, your commitment can overcome your frustration. When she prioritizes the kids over you, your commitment to the marriage makes you address it tenderly, not in anger. When he prioritizes work over you and over the family, your commitment to the marriage makes you address it with love and respect, not with bitterness or with a hateful spirit. Hey, marriages will always have issues, but commitment can help you overcome them.